All right, so thanks y'all for being here. Last week we did the barbecue, and I really enjoyed that. For those who were here, I really liked that. Thought it was a success having it outside and talking about Pentecost. Tonight we're going to look at y'all can sit down. Feel free to go sit down. Don't have to hang out on stage the whole time. Tonight we're going to look at 1 Kings 19, 1 through 18. Which is the story of Elijah in the wilderness. And Elijah winds up feeling pretty alone and worn out in those verses. And God's response to Elijah reveals some of the ways that he will help us combat our own exhaustion and loneliness when we're feeling that as well. So this passage is really long, so I'm going to do what I do sometimes when it's a long passage. I'm going to break it up. I'm not going to read it all at once, so we'll do it in parts. So first up, 1 Kings 19, 1 through 5. And it'll be on the screens. Now Ahab told Jezebel everything Elijah had done and how he had killed all the prophets with the sword. So Jezebel sent a messenger to Elijah to say, "May the gods deal with me, be it ever so severely, if by this time tomorrow I do not make your life like that of one of them." Elijah was afraid and ran for his life. When he came to Beersheba in Judah, he left his servant there, while he himself went a day's journey into the wilderness. He came to a broom bush, sat down under it, and prayed that he might die. "I've had enough, Lord," he said. "Take my life. I'm no better than my ancestors." Then he lay down under the bush and fell asleep. So, first up, some context to help make sense of the story. In the previous chapter, in 1 Kings 18, Elijah has this gigantic confrontation with the prophets of Baal. I've preached about that here before. If you don't recall the story, it's one of my favorites in the Old Testament. You've got Elijah, the lone prophet of God, and he challenges 450 prophets of Baal, or Baal, depending how you want to pronounce it, to basically a prophecy off. He says, "You get your altar set up, I'll get my altar set up, and we'll both call on our gods, and whoever's God lights the altar on fire first, that's the true God, and the other team's got to back down." So he lets them go first. And there's 450 of them, and they dance around, and they pray, and they whip themselves. They do all their crazy stuff all day long, and nothing happens. And then Elijah has his own altar doused in water, gets it all wet, and makes it like so impossible to light on fire. And then he prays to God, and God makes this huge flame, and then the prophets of Baal are put to shame, and then the Israelites round them up and kill them all. So that's what happened just before that. So you have all these prophets of Baal just killed, and it's an incredible victory for God and Elijah, but there's one little problem, which is that the prophets of Baal had been invited there by Jezebel, who's queen of Israel, so she's kind of powerful. Jezebel is really not happy with Elijah, and so that's where our story picks up. Ahab tells Jezebel what happened, and she sends a messenger with this message. Basically, "I'm going to kill you by tomorrow." That's her message. Now, pause with me for a moment. If you're going to kill somebody, hopefully you're not planning to do that, is sending them in advance notice the way that you go about doing it? Like, "I would like to inform you, tomorrow I'm going to kill you." No, you don't do that. I don't put it past Jezebel that she would kill Elijah. She was pretty evil, and the Bible does not paint her well at all. But in this case, I don't actually think that was her plan. Elijah's just come off this major victory, and it would have caused a huge uproar if she just arrested this guy and killed him, who just clearly after he made himself a clear messenger from God. But she could scare him away, and that's exactly what she did. She sends this message, and it's basically a notice to get out of town or else. And Elijah complies. He just gets up and runs. And I think it's amazing how quickly Elijah turns around and runs after what just happened. He'd just come back to Israel, and he just had this major victory and the prophets of Baal and all of that. And if there was ever a moment where he should have been able to trust God to take care of him, that was the moment. He just had all this happen. And yet, at the first threat from Jezebel, he takes off running into the wilderness, right back where he came from. So I think there's something deeper happening here. This is not just a fear of Jezebel. Because when Elijah runs into the wilderness, he lies down, he prays to God that he would just die. He says, "Lord, let me die. I've had enough. Take my life. I'm no better than my ancestors." But think about it. If Elijah wanted to die, all he had to do was stay in Jerusalem. Jezebel, or not Jerusalem, he says stay in Israel. If Elijah wanted to die, he could have just stayed there, and Jezebel would have had him killed, or so she said. So this is not fear. What's happening here is spiritual exhaustion. Elijah is worn out. He's dealing with a common phenomenon that happens to a lot of people in ministry. It's where you hear about it a lot, but it happens to everybody in a lot of different professions all over the place. It's called burnout is what we usually call it. But exhaustion, burnout, whatever you want to talk about. Elijah is worn out. He's done. He's given up because there's no way to go on. Elijah might be afraid of Jezebel, but he knows that if he trusts in God, God could take care of him. I mean, he's faced down armies. He's faced down whole groups of people. So on a normal day, he's not going to go running from Jezebel. But this is about Elijah. It's not about Jezebel for him. He's burnt out on the life of a messenger of God. And if he could resign, he would do it. So if you've ever experienced burnout or exhaustion, then you know exactly what Elijah is going through. Whether it's your career, or your schooling, or your relationship, or family issues, or something that God has called you to do, if you've experienced a moment where you just want to throw up your hands and walk away, then you know what Elijah is going through. Exhaustion is a real problem, and spiritual exhaustion happens a lot more than we'd like to admit. And like Elijah, it happens at any moment. For some people, it happens after their biggest successes, like it did with Elijah. Inside, you feel that burden of weariness and loneliness. You feel like everything you're doing doesn't matter. So I want to continue with 1 Kings 19, 5 through 10. All at once an angel touched him and said, "Get up and eat." He looked around, and there by his head was some bread baked over hot coals and a jar of water. He ate and drank and then lay down again. The angel of the Lord came back a second time and touched him and said, "Get up and eat, for the journey is too much for you." So he got up and ate and drank. Strengthened by that food, he traveled 40 days and 40 nights till he reached Horeb, the mountain of God. And there he went into a cave and spent the night. And the word of the Lord came to him, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" He replied, "I have been very zealous for the Lord God Almighty. The Israelites have rejected your covenant, torn down your altars, and put your prophets to death with the sword. I'm the only one left, and now they're trying to kill me too." In this passage, we see that God provides for Elijah's immediate needs, but doesn't address the deeper exhaustion of his soul. God had a bigger plan in mind for that, and we're going to get there. But first, I want to say a couple of things about this section. So first is that God does provide what Elijah needed in the moment, but it's not what Elijah asked for. In the depths of Elijah's weariness and sorrow, what God provides is just food and water. The angel says, "Get up and eat, for the journey is too much for you." There's a divine comfort in the simple action of a meal, to have that meal provided for him. But I think the deeper lesson in that is that we can't be afraid to cry out to God with honesty, to pray honestly. Elijah did not pray for an angel. He did not pray for food. He did not pray for bread. He prayed to die and be finished with this life. And yet when he prayed that honest prayer, he was provided with just enough comfort to keep going. So we should learn to pray to God honestly. Not what we think God wants to hear, but pray with all the anger and the sorrow and the exhaustion in your soul, because God can handle it, and he's going to provide what you need to keep going. But that comes with a caveat, which is that God didn't actually answer Elijah's deeper need in that moment. He gave him what he needed to keep going for the time being. And so Elijah travels to the cave, and then God comes to Elijah and asks him what is truly troubling him. And Elijah's response reveals the real deep nature of his complaint. His work has been for nothing, and he's alone. Those are the complaints of Elijah's soul. And those are the complaints that a lot of us feel when we're feeling burnt out. Whatever you're feeling burnt out in, it's usually because you've been working really hard and you don't see anything coming of it, or you've been working alone and you feel like nobody's on your side, or a combination of both. And so we might not put it as bluntly as Elijah, but there's something really deeply tiring, exhausting about feeling alone and about not seeing any fruits of your labor. And so the Lord then responds, and we'll begin with verses 11 through 14. The Lord said, "Go out and stand on the mountain in the presence of the Lord, for the Lord is about to pass by." Then a great and powerful wind tore the mountains apart and shattered the rocks before the Lord, but the Lord was not in the wind. After the wind there was an earthquake, but the Lord was not in the earthquake. After the earthquake came a fire, but the Lord was not in the fire. And after the fire came a gentle whisper. When Elijah heard it, he pulled his cloak over his face, went out, and stood at the mouth of the cave. Then a voice said to him, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" He replied, "I have been very zealous for the Lord God Almighty. The Israelites have rejected your covenant, torn down your altars, and put your prophets to death with the sword. I'm the only one left, and now they're trying to kill me too." I think this is one of the most famous passages in 1 Kings. There's a lot of sermons that have been preached about finding God in the gentle whisper, not the earthquake or the fire or the wind. And I think that's good stuff to talk about. But what I really want to focus on with that tonight is that I think it says something about how we deal with burnout and exhaustion, which is that a lot of times if you face spiritual burnout, what you want is a big flashy miracle. You want something big to happen to just change it all at once. I know for me, sometimes if I'm feeling tired, if I'm feeling a little burnt out on this service, I want to just come to the night and find 20 new people randomly showed up. And all of a sudden, we've got a huge night service, and it just keeps rolling. But that's not how God operates. That wouldn't actually ease the burden of my soul. In fact, it would probably just give me more stuff to worry about. He says that we restore our energy instead by meeting him through the quiet. In the time that we can get rid of distractions and spend time listening for that still, small voice. But more importantly for our story tonight, God comes to Elijah after all those things, in the still, small voice, in the silence, and he asks him again why he's on the mountain, and Elijah repeats the exact same complaint from before. So even finding God in the quiet doesn't automatically restore Elijah's soul. So finally, here meeting him in the quiet, God responds to Elijah's complaint, and I'm going to read the last section, 15 through 18. God replies, "The Lord said to him, 'Go back the way you came, go to the desert of Damascus, and when you get there, anoint Hazael king over Aram. Also anoint Jehu, son of Nimshi, king over Israel, and anoint Elisha, son of Shaphat, from Abel-Meholah, to succeed you as prophet. Jehu will put to death any who escape the sword of Hazael, and Elisha will put to death any who escape the sword of Jehu. Yet I reserve 7,000 in Israel, all whose knees have not bowed down to Baal and whose mouths have not kissed him.'" So finally Elijah receives God's answer, and what does he get? More work. That's what he gets as the answer. It's not what you'd expect. When someone's experiencing burnout, the last thing they want is more work to do. But this work is different because it's a direct response to the needs that Elijah has. He complains that his work is coming to nothing, but both of those complaints, the nothingness and the aloneness, are answered through this. First, he tells Elijah to appoint new kings in Syria and in Israel. That's really good news because on the Israel front, obviously, currently Ahab and Jezebel are the king and queen of Israel. So appointing a new king means they're not going to be around for much longer. And appointing a new king in Syria, Jezebel is from Syria. So the support that she's probably getting from home is not coming anymore. So that's good news. It means that his enemies are going away. The prophets of Baal that have been supported are not going to be supported anymore. It's basically a victory for Elijah's work of getting rid of the prophets of Baal and returning Israel to a healthier king. And then the other part, of course, is that Elijah is given Elisha. And he's not going to be alone anymore. He's not going to have to work alone. He tells him that Elisha is going to be his successor and his partner. And that's not a common occurrence. We very rarely see prophets work together in the Old Testament as sort of a master and apprentice sort of thing. It's not really a common situation that we see in the Bible. Elijah and Elisha is a very unique circumstance. But God knew that Elijah needed that. He needed Elisha to prop him up, basically, to keep him going. He needed a partner in the work because he was getting exhausted. And then also, God tells Elijah that there's 7,000 in Israel who have not bowed to Baal. That even when Elijah thought he was alone, there's all these people who are with him in secret. They just weren't visible to him. So the lesson that I have for us tonight is not that God's going to suddenly appear every time we get weary and give us exactly what we need. But God does show us that we can combat our burnout by giving our problems to him and by finding partners for our work. God gives Elijah the new kings in Syria and Israel, and they wind up being indirect partners, and they help him out. And in the same way, we should be on the lookout for people who will help us realize the good works that we're trying to get done, and who will help us to further that work. And God also gave Elijah Elisha as a partner, and that's someone who would come along Elijah and lift him up when he's weary, and comfort him when he's burdened, and rejoice with him when he succeeded. So if you're feeling burnout, it's probably because you're alone or you're not seeing your work come to fruition. And I can't promise you that God's going to deliver you your own personal Elisha, but I can promise you that God knows the deepest needs that you have, and he's going to provide what you need. So, honestly lay your concerns before the Lord. Lay your burdens before him. Don't try to hide your burnout. Don't try to hide the exhaustion of your soul. Just be honest with God, because he will give you what you need. And so no matter what, you can know that you're not going to be alone, because God is with you, and he'll provide the person or the things that you need to carry on your work. So now I invite you to gather into groups. We get a couple of minutes here to see that there are people around us, people who are going to celebrate us and lift us up together. And so gather into groups of 2, 3, 4, spend about 5 minutes in prayer with each other, lift each other up, and then we'll gather back together for the last few minutes of worship.